The Assisted Dying Bill 2023 is being progressed now through the Legislative Council, and at the principal stage of the bill there was a successful call for further evidence to be taken. We've heard a lot over the past year or so about the case in favour and against the principle of introducing legislation to allow people to end their life. So on Perspective this week, we're considering what the legislation now looks like, why new evidence is needed to be considered, and what concerns remain. To begin, this is how Peter Greenhill MLC introduced the legislation to LegCo.
The principles of this bill, as amended before us today, are as follows. The bill is to enable persons who are diagnosed by a registered medical practitioner to be terminally ill, and where that person is reasonably expected to die within 12 months, for them to be provided at their request with specific assistance to end their own life. Mr. President, this bill only applies where the person has the capacity, as defined under the Capacity Act 2023, to be able to make a decision to end their own life because they do not have an impairment of or a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain, and it only applies where the person has been informed about their diagnosis, prognosis and treatments available, and only applies where the person has a clear and settled intention to end their own life, reached voluntarily without coercion or duress, and it only applies where the person has made a formal declaration to that effect. The bill only applies if on that day of declaration, the declaration is made, the person is aged over 18 and the person has been ordinary resident in the island for not less than 5 years. The bill also sets out in detail how and by whom assistance in dying may be given, and also recognises and respects that persons, including healthcare professionals, may have a conscientious objection and do not wish to exercise functions under the Act. It also recognises that those healthcare professionals who do intend to exercise functions under the Act will notify the Department of Health and Social Care and ensure that they have received the appropriate guidance and training from that department before doing so. Another key principle of the bill is that no healthcare professional should be under any duty by contract, statute or any other legal requirement to raise the subject of assisted dying with a patient or to offer assisted dying to a patient as a treatment option. The bill makes it clear that a person who provides assistance in accordance with this Act does not commit an offence under the Criminal Law Act 1981. The Act also makes it clear that when a person dies only as a result of lawful assistance, no inquest is needed. Other principles cover the codes of practice that the Department of Health and Social Care may issue and how the Department shall monitor and report on the operation of the Act. The bill before us addresses offences that a person may commit in relation to, for example, coercion, pressurisation, creating a false declaration and destroying a declaration made by another person. The bill refers to the penalties that will be incurred by those actions. Finally, the bill sets out the wording for the form of declaration that would need to be signed by the terminally ill person and witnessed by someone who is not a relative of that person, is not directly involved with that person's care or treatment, and is not someone who would gain financially from that person's death. The declaration must also be countersigned by the attending doctor and an independent doctor. In conclusion, medical treatment and palliative care has improved dramatically over recent years. Many more patients are surviving longer, being offered newer treatments and the choice of more effective pain control. But there are still times when medical and scientific advancement is not enough. Some terminally ill patients will still experience severe physical or emotional distress that cannot be relieved. Some of those terminally ill patients will wish to be able to make the choice to end their own life in a controlled and dignified way. That is what this bill is intended to achieve.
That was mover of the bill, Peter Greenhill MLC. Paul Crane was the only MLC to oppose the bill.
I wasn't surprised. I thought maybe there would have been one or two others who were perhaps still, open to influence, as it were, and some people recognised some elements of what I was saying, but I think everybody had pretty well made their minds up where they were going with this. It spent so long in the Keys. I think our first briefing on this must have been almost 2 years ago. So we've been living with this for a very, very long time. And so the vote this morning was 7 in favour of progressing beyond principles. There was an amendment in there to introduce a stage in there where you can get oral evidence, an evidence gathering stage.
Right.
So there was an amendment to that effect. So there will be an evidence stage before we move on to clauses.
And that evidence stage, surely to goodness there's been so much evidence already presented to the Keys, and I'm guessing, having already listened to all of this, how much more evidence do you need?
I think that's a fair question. I think it may be for some people on some specific things. I think the fact that things are moving in the adjacent island, as it were, the private member's bill that's had its first reading now in the House Commons. So Kim Ledbetter has chosen this bill. There was already a bill slowly making its way through the Lords, Lord Falconer's bill. It's had the first reading, but the bill hasn't been written yet. So the legislative drafting is going on, and it's got a second reading due in late November. And part of the thinking behind the evidence stage was we do need to be looking at what they're doing there to see will that make it easier or more difficult for us. If they are going ahead with a bill, then maybe some of the changes happening there could relate to what we're doing. So I think it's very much looking in that direction.
One of the big concerns, I think, of those who voted against in Keys, and possibly quite a legitimate concern, is this whole impact of how a Manx system which allows for assisted dying interacts with a UK system which doesn't allow for assisted dying. Presumably the mover was able to give some level of reassurance as to how that might work.
I think there is recognition, and the bill that's going through, there's quite a bit of time put in place before it's going to take effect, So I think there is recognition in the Keys, in Legislative Council. There's a lot of work to do on this, and that's one of the areas where the work is there. People who are working and moving between the two jurisdictions. If one jurisdiction is saying that absolutely no assisted dying, that assisting suicide is automatically an offence, and the other system is saying, well, oh no, it's permitted in these circumstances, some tight conditions, then there clearly would be differences, and this is where, going to what the medics on the island said, the Isle of Man Medical Society, 74% of them were against this happening, and 34% of them said they would consider leaving the Isle of Man. And one of the reasons they were giving for leaving was not simply a sort of moral or conscientious reason. They were saying this could really get in the way of me following the regulations I'm supposed to follow. I could get in trouble for this, so they weren't happy with that. So,
if the UK had some legislation introduced in relation to assisted dying, it kind of then would overtake whatever we're trying to do here, I presume. We wouldn't then hold out for whatever we've passed, which could have some differences to what happens in the UK.
The talk about the evidence stage was in part a wish. Diane Kelsey in particular was expressing the view that she would like to see, as soon as we can, our legislation placed alongside the UK legislation to see what we're looking at. It may be that some of the things that have been hard fought for in the Keys, some of the safeguarding issues hard fought for in the Keys, maybe they will be better than we're seeing, so there could be a desire to keep some slight differences where we think we've got something better. On the other hand, there may be some things in the bill in England that impress the Tynwald members here and might lead to some sort of amendment. But from the comments made this morning, yes, there are some people who are ready when we get to the clauses stage to bring up suggestions and look for possible amendments. Yeah, that is there. Indeed, I had been raising the issue in particular of coercion, and one of the members came back to me and said, I think in the bill, at this point here and at that point there, we could strengthen this safeguarding against coercion. So they're ready for that. But I think any thought, having had a 7-1 vote this morning, I think it's unthinkable now that the Legislative Council will end up not passing this bill.
And that point about coercion, it's a charge that is always levied against such legislation by those who don't want to see it. People who are supporters of the legislation will say, look, we'll have very clear safeguards in place. Doctors will have some level of training and support to be able to see what coercion looks like, and as a result, this issue is, well, it's not the concern that perhaps you're suggesting it is.
In my view, I think it's very difficult on the coercion issue, and I know I quoted some of the expert witnesses that the Keys had brought in, some of the medics, some of them in law, legal roles, and the view from them was quite persistently that there were perhaps two different groups of thought. Either one, we cannot detect this, we're not skilled to detect this, it's impossible to detect it or whatever, and some others saying there's really no need to detect this because what's happening in terminal dying is not relatives trying to get the person to have assisted dying. The picture is one of the relatives trying to say, no, don't go through with this, so then but I couldn't follow that at all. I think we've got
so effectively the suggestion is coercion works both ways. It could be people feeling as though they are a drain on society and should no longer be causing that drain on their family, and then on the other hand, someone suggesting that actually the family would be rather keen to ensure that they didn't go for the assistance.
I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I'd call that coercion. It wouldn't worry me as much if people were persuading a vulnerable person not to go through with assisted suicide, that assisted dying. That is I'm more comfortable than that than the other way. But when you're in the position where the Office of National Statistics specifically say that in England there are up to 1.5 million cases a year where people are being financially abused, mainly by relatives, friends, carers and things like that. And so the scale of that is absolutely massive. So
that is a massive.
Yeah.
That's
so when
that's
you come to a context here, and then you're saying, okay, some of the vulnerable people here and most of the people who are expected to apply for assisted dying, other people who are terminally ill or older people, so private residential care, they're paying $50,000 a year and their savings are dwindling away, and the worry is that a family oversteps the mark in terms of this, and it's so hard to detect because the person applying for assisted dying is not likely to be complaining about the family forcing them to do it, But the within the bill, the defence against that, if you like, the safeguarding against that, is that there will be two doctors who see their medical records and will interview them, and will detect if there's coercion going on. There will have been a psychiatrist involved, but not at that stage. In the bill as it stands, that's at the stage where you're identifying their capacity to make the decision, So this is not trying to say, is this person under some sort of pressure, being manipulated? to go for assisted dying. Somebody may be benefiting from that, and there may be a link.
You also raised an interesting point about community. Yeah, that okay, people should perhaps have certain rights, but those rights exist within a community, and perhaps. Well, I don't know. You explain how this works in your thinking.
If you go back to the suicide prevention strategy and the report that was produced that came to Tynwald on that, one of the figures in there was quite an eye-opener, because in terms of what triggered the suicides that had taken place in the Isle of Man, 8% of those are triggered by a previous suicide. Okay, so the notion that what one person does affects another person is absolutely there, and that is life as I understand it. I live in a community, and we're interconnected in so many different ways, and within that community you've got some great responsibilities too. So you've got freedom of speech, but actually there's all sorts of restraints on what you can do with that. So is it okay? I guess in the 21st century this issue of personal autonomy is in there. So who else apart from me can possibly have a right over if I want to die? The idea that it's my death, my decision, no one else should interfere with that. Actually, the question then is, well, if you choose assisted dying, would your death affect anybody else? And as I said, in suicides, it's affected others. But some of the speakers that came across at different stages have spelt it out, how their disability or their incontinence or whatever else, they've met people who've said to them, if I was going to be incontinent, I'd have assisted suicide. And you suddenly begin to feel a guilt that, well, this is my life. So... Well, he says it's not worth living. He says he's a burden. He wants, and here's me sort of living with this. So you can see how people who were already vulnerable, who are already living with their own struggles in life, are then impacted by this. So once you've hit on the idea that somebody. My death, my decision. Actually, their decision is impacting on others in negative ways.
But there are significant safeguards in place to ensure these things are not the reality that you're suggesting.
What have you got in mind on coercion? You think?
Well, I think in terms of what conditions are deemed to be the kind of conditions that you have to have if you are to go for assisted dying.
Yes.
Those safeguards are there. The safeguards of having the two doctors, so it's not just one making the decision. There's quite a bit in there.
Yes,
isn't
there's a range of safeguards. You can list them. You've got to be 18. You've got to be terminally ill. That has to be a diagnosis that two doctors have been involved in determining that. You have to be of sound mind and so on. So capacity has to be there, and that can involve a psychiatric examination, so on. And you have to be of a settled mind, and then it comes down to that you're not being coerced or under duress to do that. And for many of those, they're straightforward. But for me, anyway, when it comes to the coercion bit and duress, I think it's really, really difficult to identify, to detect, especially for a vulnerable elderly person who either doesn't realise they're being manipulated or is in denial about them being manipulated. They're the ones who've applied for assisted dying, so they're not going to be the ones saying, oh, by the way, I'm being coerced to do this. So if they're denying it, where do the two doctors interviewing them and looking at their medical records go to be able to say, oh, there's coercion going on here? So I think it's difficult. Clearly, I didn't win that argument, So others thought that yes, there were deterrents and safeguards. There's you can be fined if you're guilty of coercing somebody to apply for assisted suicide. So yes, there are some safeguards that are still there. Yes, I think it's hard given the level of the cost of private residential care and so on, and people's what they've saved in the house, they've sold it off, and you see that dwindling, and the families see that dwindling, in the way that you get 1.5 million cases a year in England alone, where older people over 65 are suffering financially. This is on a big scale. This is not just the odd bad apple.
So presumably, from Isle of Man government's position, this does sound a little callous the way I'm going to put this, but we have a significant problem in relation to funding healthcare and indeed benefits, pensions, things like this. I'm guessing if a person doesn't live the length of life that perhaps would have been available to them, they plump for assisted dying, that could save substantial amounts of money from a hard-pressed health service.
I think that there's going to be a cost involved in each assisted death. Yes, there might be a saving involved. I think if you try to put that on a economic footing for the Manx economy or something, the expectation is, the hope, if you like, is that this will still be relatively small numbers of people. Suggestions of 2 to 8 have perhaps come out, that sort of size a year, and they were already have a diagnosis that it's reasonably predictable that their death will be within 12 months. So you're not dealing with people living for 20 years. So it's small numbers of people, small amounts of time.
But there are likely to be costs involved. But and the other element to this, of course, is someone is going to have to do it. And from what you've said already, it would appear that the medical profession are far from wholeheartedly supportive of this. Do you think there are going to be enough people to be able to do the deed when it comes to assisted dying?
My understanding is that that's the case, that there has been an indication from some of the medics that they would be prepared to be involved in this work. So my understanding is that that's not a problem. That's not going to be a difficulty. It comes back to parts of this bill are hugely emotive, hugely sensitive, and a number of people point out how yes, in some jurisdictions there are people who've built up a reputation for having carried out 400 or whatever assisted dying, and you sort of look at these people with a bit of a scant glance or whatever, and wonder what's in that for them. But I guess for them, they would see that they're ending suffering, I guess.
And then the final point I think that you made in your speech was in relation to a mandate. You believe that there is no political mandate for this bill?
Well, it was interesting because the debate this morning partly focused on that. When I'd made that point, I was making the point about the mandate that there've been a number of surveys and consultation carried out. Sadly, so many of the consultations that government does, the numbers in it are not the important bit. It's the comments. But in terms of the numbers, there have been a couple of surveys that showed a majority here in favour of it. Then the consultation was very, very close, but marginally against. But the problem with all of those is that people were self-selecting, or some people at least were self-selecting into them. And if you're choosing to be a respondent to a survey, the survey cannot be statistically significant on that basis. The statistical significance would always hinge on the fact that the respondents are chosen randomly or stratified systematically. They represent somehow the full population. So we've got no evidence there. The election doesn't provide a mandate because we didn't have we had very few manifestos that had a commitment to assisted dying, so there's no mandate there, and this makes it difficult to know. The feeling this morning from Legislative Council was that yeah, that there have been changes in views, and that there's movement toward we're living in changed days. People are more willing to look at that. I made the point as part of it as once a famous survey, if you like, that was done. It was something called the Salvation Dying Well Survey, 2021, carried out on behalf of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. And in that survey, it emerged that only 43% of respondents understood what assisted dying was, that this was being given some sort of toxins that kill you, or taking yourself toxins that kill you. 43%. There were 42% who thought that assisted dying just meant you were allowed not to take life-maintaining drugs. Well, actually, many people in a hospice, many of the hospices around the world, you can't come on the programme unless you're stopping the medication to try and make you healthier when you're moving on to helping you make the best out of your remaining life. So there was some evidence that some of the surveys that have been carried out, some big surveys in the UK, that actually people were not too sure what they were right about. And this, of course, the question here came up on should we have a referendum, and it didn't reach us in Legislative Council, but I was always concerned about a referendum that you then get some really fast figures, that we've got 70-30 or whatever it is. But if the 70% didn't understand what was meant by some of the terms, then and if they haven't thought it through, this is a classic example for me of an area where the electorate relies on those who are in place in government. And as I say, we've been getting briefings for a year before it started appearing. I think I've been to, I'm guessing, but I'm not exaggerating, between 15 and 20 briefings lasting hour and a half, 2 hours over this period. And I've read books, etc., etc. So well steeped in it, in a sense, before you reach the point of making a decision. And even when you get to that point, it's clear that you can have different views come out of all this, which is why I'm voting in a group of one against the other seven, And,
well, you may be joined by another. We don't know what Trish the Bish, the new bishop's view is going to be.
Yeah.
Can we expect, because we're at the end of the programme now, but can we expect some helpful amendments from Mr. Crane?
I will try. I mean, I think, some of the documents, some of the emails I received within the last week have begun to look beyond the current position. I think my position today was we're at the principle stage, and some of the principles like coercion, I think it's hard to see what you can do to change that at the clauses stage. So I've gone with the principle today, it appears that in principle I've lost this. So I'm going to have to look hard at the clauses to see, do I think there are clauses that, even though I wish we weren't at that point, that is where we're going to be. So are there clauses I think can be improved, can be made better? Yes, of course, I'll look to that. And I've already had one conversation with a colleague who was pointing out how there may be some ways in which you could strengthen the safeguarding in relation to coercion. And it might mean that instead of just having a psychiatrist involved when the capacity of the person is being decided, if there was any hint of an issue when the doctors were doing their attempt to detect coercion, if they had any thought of a problem, perhaps they could bring in a psychiatrist who looks at that again. And what I'm not sure about is the extent to which psychiatrists would say they're trained to detect coercion, because the doctors in the House of Keys, as expert witnesses, were saying they're not trained and they don't think they can. So I'm kind of sceptical about whether it's possible to remove the coercion problem. But I want to make the bill the best we can. If it's got to go forward, okay. There's no point me sitting outside of that.
Paul Crane, MLC. Is Peter Greenhill content that there are sufficient safeguards?
There are, but we must make sure that the person who's making that decision is competent to make that decision, that they've received a terminal judgment from their doctors, and that's backed up by somebody else confirming that, that they make a formal declaration, and they have the ability to make that declaration that they do want to, at a particular time, to end their life. And then there's a lot of provisions in there about protecting those people, so there are safeguarding elements in there. But also it also allows people who conscientiously object to helping someone because of their own beliefs. That's absolutely fine. They're able to step back. And it also makes sure that anyone who wants to try and put coercion or duress on that person making that decision, that there are penalties there against those people. So those are additional to the safeguards. That's actually saying, look, if you were thinking about doing this, don't do this. And that could be up to a life sentence. So those things are very important.
And I'm guessing that the absolute detail as to how this is going to work will come in regulation, presuming, of course, that the bill gets its final reading in LegCo and it eventually gets royal assent. Presumably a lot of regulation is going to have to be drawn up.
There will be, but a lot of those follow the what's in the bill itself. So it's worthwhile people to actually understand every element of that and in the clauses to protect people and make sure everything's done in the proper way.
So then in terms of those safeguards, I suppose many people, where assisted dying legislation has been introduced, there are quite a few people who have concerns. I mean, other people actually think that it's working extremely well, but there are also people who are concerned, and particularly in relation to this aspect of coercion. It's quite a difficult one, I would have thought, to actually police, because if someone is old and frail, for example, and maybe feeling that they are a bit of a nuisance on their families, the family doesn't actually need to put that much pressure on them for them to then think, actually, you know what, the easiest thing for me to do here is to go down the assisted dying route.
Well, they certainly mustn't put pressure on them, and that's what I've been saying about those penalties that are there. It really, at the end of the day, is the choice of that individual. And I think we've seen so many cases of those people being in such a bad way that they have made that determination and at the right time want to make that determination. I think that's what we've got to be there to support.
In relation then to the bill, I mean, it's not the mildest and most straightforward of bills for you to choose to take through Legislative Council. Why did you agree to take this?
Well, that's a very interesting question. A lot of it's down to my personal experience. Both of my parents went past the age of 90. My father, on his above his bed, had those letters DNR, and at that time I didn't know what they meant. So he passed away then, fortunately okay. But my mother, who'd been with him, since they were young, she just herself switched herself off. So we went through that. But very importantly, it's my own personal experiences on top of that. And I had a brain tumour removed 7 years ago. There's the sort of situation where, of that particular type of tumour, they were able to operate, and we're talking today, which is great. But had that been in a different location, it could have been inoperable. And I would have been left with a situation where I would have had a very short time left to live. And had that happened after this bill was in, I would have been in a position where I would have wanted to make that decision. My wife and I went through lots of things relating to our assets, everything, our children, and what we needed to prepare just in case something went wrong in the operation as well. So those sort of things to me has led me to talk to other people about this. And I've had lots of discussions in the recess period after Keys put this through with a 3/4 majority. Lots of discussions with groups of people about what they felt. And I must admit that the number of people who were fully in support of this were about the same number, 3/4. The others were asking questions about safeguarding, and we'll be looking at that during clauses as well. But for me, I felt that's then a very important thing for us to get right.
And of course it is very important to get right. Obviously there is there are bits of legislation that are being brought forward in the Parliament in the UK, which may influence what we're doing. Equally, they may be unsuccessful, and previous attempts in UK Parliament have been unsuccessful. So we may actually be an outlier on this. What about the concerns that some people express about that, particularly in relation to the medical profession, that it will be difficult, not impossible, but difficult for perhaps visiting consultants that may wish to come to the Isle of Man. They're based in the UK. They give a diagnosis in relation to a particular patient that they have a very short time to live. Are they then deemed to have taken part in this assisted dying process because effectively their diagnosis is essential for the assisted dying process to proceed?
Yeah, we do have 2 doctors that have to sign off, and whether those people are primarily on island, they will be, because they'll know the patient and everything else. Consultants coming across, that's an interesting one to think about, but it's our island we're talking about here. Excuse me. We are a self-governing Crown dependency. We have our own Parliament and legislature. We look at other jurisdictions, but it's our decisions we have to make. So we have to set that up. And as I said before, if there are people with reasons that they don't want to be involved with this type of thing from the profession, then they can step back from that. There's no problem with that. Conscientious objection is built into the bill and quite right, respects their position.
Are you concerned that perhaps the Isle of Man will be seen as a place for people to come effectively to end their lives? I mean, is there a safeguard against that kind of thing happening?
In the bill that's with us at the moment, there is a safeguard in terms of 5 years. My own personal feeling on that is it depends actually when that terminal diagnosis takes place. In my particular case, with the brain tumour, I'd only been on island for 4 years. And had I absolutely needed that operation and that came up with it, they could not operate. Then under the way the bill is actually set out at the moment, I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of assisted dying. So I think there may well be potential for a slight adjustment to what we have in the bill at the moment, just to take into account those people who are given that diagnosis of terminal illness after they've been living on the island. I think that's worth looking at. But at the moment, that protection is certainly in there.
One of the roles of the Legislative Council is to say to the House of Keys, or to occasionally to give wake-up calls to the House of Keys and say, well, actually, wait a minute, this aspect hasn't been properly considered, that aspect hasn't been properly considered. One of the interesting elements to this is very few Keys candidates actually put in their manifestos that if they were elected, they would be wanting to introduce assisted dying legislation. What do we know about the public appetite for this? I mean, is there a strong mood across the island in favour? Is it a mixed view? I mean, where are we at with that?
Well, certainly in my opinion, as I was saying earlier, those conversations I've had, the meetings I've had to try and get that sort of feedback has all been very positive about bringing this in. But also we do have to respect that there are those people who do object to it. And we shouldn't be saying they are wrong. We'll say they're entitled to their own opinion. At the end of the day, this is about choice. The individual is the person who must choose whether to end their life or not. And I think that's the way it should be.
Paul Crane, in his comments, has suggested that actually the choice of the individual shouldn't effectively step in the way or interfere with the choice of the collective, the community. And his argument is that that's exactly what happens here. There may be that individuals, assessing their particular medical circumstances, reach the decision that they would like assisted dying. But the implication then to the rest of society is that assisted dying becomes a norm, and people get used to this, and potentially there's mission creep in relation to the legislation. Yes, of course, at the moment it's set in stone and it's very clear what things are, but once people get used to a particular thing happening, then, we could add in these people and this group and that group. Is that a fair argument, or was Paul Crane, who was in a minority of one, was Paul being a little disingenuous, do you think?
I never have a problem with, and Paul, I've said this to Paul afterwards, that I'm very pleased that he is making his own comments there, and that's part of everything that we should hear. But as you've said, there are 7 of us in that debate that are in favour of the principles of this bill and taking it forward. I really think that this is something in our community that a very large number of people, I don't need to define whether that's 50% or 90% or whatever, there's a very large percentage of our people who really want to be able to make that choice. And I fully respect those people who don't want to make that choice, and they won't have to.
And finally then, there are plenty of people in the Isle of Man who believe that palliative care is a suitable alternative to assisted dying without the new concern being introduced that effectively doctors will be placed in this kind of position where they are helping people to die when they think perhaps better alternatives are available. What would you say in relation to that? Surely palliative care is a good alternative to this.
Certainly, medical treatment and palliative care has improved dramatically over recent years. Many more patients are surviving longer, they're being offered newer treatments and the choice of much more effective pain control. But there are still times when medical and scientific achievement and advancement is not enough. There are some terminal ill patients who still experience severe physical, emotional distress that can't be relieved. And some of those terminally ill patients are the ones that wish to be able to make the choice to end their own life in a controlled and in a dignified way. And really that's what this bill's all about.
That was assisted dying bill mover Peter Greenhill, MLC. Talking then to Diane Kelsey, and you successfully moved that additional information be taken in relation to the bill. Now we are into the final 2 years of the term of office for the House of Keys. Chances are that the evidence that you're looking for may take another, 6 months, a year. And it could well be that you run the bill out of time. Were you being sneaky here, or is this a genuine attempt to try and get the bill into a better place? And I guess I think you'll go with the latter.
Thanks very much, Phil. Obviously, it's nothing to do with slowing down the bill. The fact that we're here to scrutinise any legislation that comes before us, if something either perks our interest or someone gets in touch with us, we say, we want to look at that in more detail, then that's exactly what we should be doing as MLCs. There's a lot of discussion whether we're value for money or whatever. Well, the very thing we're there for is to scrutinise legislation. So purely from an integrity perspective, if this was to slow down the bill, I wouldn't have voted for the principles and I would have caused other issues. This is not that. I'm on record as being pro-choice across the board, and in particular was very interested in one of the early briefings we had from a palliative care doctor who was also a proponent proponent of assisted dying, because he talked about the chance for people to have honest conversations with one another. At the moment, it is illegal for in this island and in adjacent isles to support assisted dying. That just doesn't feel right, because it forces people down certain routes and certain conversations. And really interestingly, or not conversations, interestingly, what the palliative care doctor did say to us, once people have got the right and the choice, they very rarely then take it up. But it does give them the chance to have those honest conversations with their families and friends.
And you're part of the reason that I think you put forward for moving to an evidence stage was the ongoing legislative attempts in the UK. Those could take a very long time to get through.
Actually, that wasn't the reason for calling for the evidence stage. We were passed this bill on the 23rd of July. On the 26th of July, Lord Faulkner moved a bill in the House of Lords, which had already been out and around, and in fact was a modification of ones he's been trying to put through for some time. And then over the summer months, the ballot was held for private members' bills for the new Commons, and the first ballot private members' bill that came out, or MP, was Kim Leadbeater, and she's come forward with and presented a assisted dying bill. But for me, that's new information. Both of those are new information, because one is a definite proposal for the Lords, and the second is a proposal but with no detail to it yet, other than the short and long titles of the bill. That bill is due to be heard at its second reading in the Commons on the 29th of November.
Because bizarrely, of course, this had its first reading in the House of Commons and there wasn't even a printed bill.
I think that's quite normal from what I've been told. So, and they'll presumably now be pulling forward all the drafting instructions, as we do here as well. Private members' bills, as you realise, are very different, as is this one is a very different genesis, because it's not come from government. This is very much both in the case of the Isle of Man and in the case of UK, these are private members bringing these forwards as opposed to being proposed by the government of the day.
So how long then do you expect to take with this evidence stage?
For the questions I have, it could be as quick as 30 minutes. And I don't mean that in a trivialisation of it. It's a case of saying, what are in those two bills that are different? Have they already been looked at by the committee and Keys? Because there was a phenomenal amount of debate and really well-informed discussion, such that amendments came through to the original bill as drafted. So what we see is something that's already been thoroughly analysed and put together. I see our role as picking up on any other things that have happened since that point, or something we're not sure about, and why did they get to that point? That's what our clauses stage would be about. What the evidence stage is just to be able to bring forward those pieces of evidence. If we're able to speak to MPs and members of the House of Lords, that would be great, but that's not the point of what we're trying to do, or I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just make sure that we understand where the UK has got to, so that we understand whether there's any lessons to be learnt. What I don't want to countenance is that we'll wait for them to make a decision. This should be about where have they got to now with the legal process and legal drafters and advice. Is there anything in there that might be useful for the Isle of Man to make this a more robust legal practice?
If, and of course it is a big if we got to the position where the UK did pass some legislation and then we had different legislation, that could cause its own set of problems, couldn't it?
Yes, of course it would, but that's why we have post-legislative scrutiny. That's why we would see whether actually what's come out of the UK is better or worse or just different, that we want to pick up some of their best practice. That would be for future legislators to look at. If we can get ours as robust as we can now and we're satisfied with it, I'd like to think that what comes out of the UK will be complementary to what we do. And if it's different, then we would review our act at that time.
In relation then to the short title of the bill going through the UK Parliament and our short title, is there much difference?
Well, there is, in the sense that ours has now sort of, I wouldn't say finalised, but settled on assisted dying bill, whereas in the UK they've added terminally ill into their titles. One is, the one going through the Lords is assisted dying for terminally ill adults, and the one that will come before the Commons is terminally ill adults, brackets, end of life. Now, those two specific nuances may actually be something that we could challenge and say, should we have terminally ill in our titles? we might decide that's not correct. But that's the sort of scrutiny and the challenging and the questioning, because I know some of the concerns are about this slippery slope and the extending to disabilities or mental health. I think, or someone's just being a nuisance. I think having terminally ill potentially in our title might actually alleviate some of those worries. But I think there's enough in our bill already that says it is for terminally ill people. So it's making sure that we don't make work as opposed to make law.
That was Diane Kelsey, MLC. So what do you think? Are you any clearer about what's proposed? Should we wait to see how similar legislation in the UK progresses? It's certainly a big issue for Tynwald to tackle, which, if passed, will have a profound impact on Manx life and death. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gaughan. Gura Maius and Geistach Rum. Thanks for listening.